So God declares us righteousness. And last week we ended with this. When God declares something righteous, what happens?
He makes it happen.
What's that? If God declares something, remember we went through the first 6 days of creation? God declared, let there be light, and what? There was light. So if God declares us righteous, it happens. Something happened. Can we go to 1 John chapter 3, verse 1? Kind of a cool verse. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 1. It's kind of an example of this. Way in the back of the Bible. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1.
See what love the Father has
There we go.
bestowed on us, that we may be called the children of God. Yet so we are.
See what love the Father has bestowed on us, that we may be called children. And what happens? And we are. When He declares something, we become that. So that's really the Catholic understanding. Okay? Okay, let's go new territory. We're still at the end of that verse 17. Let me get back to Romans. Yeah. We're back at verse 17 again. As it is written, the one who is righteous by faith will live. You see that verse in verse 17? Let's look at this a little bit. It says, as it is written. When we read that in the New Testament, what do you think that means?
Go to the Old Testament.
Where did Paul get this?
Old Testament.
From the Old Testament, as it is written. And he quotes that verse. Can we go back to that verse? Are you ready for this one? Habakkuk. Who? I don't know if we've ever been to this book in this 3 years here. Habakkuk. Chapter 2, verse 4.
Okay, give us a hint where it is.
It's in the Old Testament.
Well, that's a lot of pages.
Yeah, I'm looking. Oh, here we go. It's way toward the end of the Old Testament. A couple books before the Gospel. Habakkuk.
The rash man has
2:4. And before Ralph reads it, let me just put it in context for you. Habakkuk, a prophet. Remember back in the Old Testament time, how many tribes were there originally? 12. The 12 tribes. Do you remember what happened to the 10 tribes? They went east. And what does that mean? They fell away from God. They abandoned God. And then they were taken in exile. So there were 12 tribes. 10 of them were the bad guys. So that leaves how many good guys? 2. Okay. Habakkuk. He's writing now to the 2 remaining tribes of Israel that were still faithful to God. And does anyone know what happened to those 2 tribes of Israel eventually? Were they ever taken into captivity? Sure. I need a little more definite than sure.
Is that the Babylonian?
The Babylonian, very good. Eventually, those 2 good guys, those 2 tribes are taken into captivity. Well, Habakkuk, he's talking now to those 2 tribes that were faithful to God. They were ready to be taken into captivity. And look at what he wrote. Go ahead, Ralph.
What is it?
Habakkuk 2:4.
The rash man has no integrity, but the just man, because of his faith, shall live. Well too is treacherous, the proud, unstable man.
But the just man, because of his faith, shall live. What do you think he's telling this group of people who are ready to be taken over into captivity? They're faithful to God prior to this, and he says, because of his faith, that man shall live. What do you think he's telling that group of people? To have hope. So when you're taken into captivity, you become prisoners now. Have hope and what?
Shall live.
And keep the faith. He's encouraging them. You're going to encounter some hardships in your life. You got some bad things coming. You've remained faithful to God so far. He's telling them, keep your faith. Keep your faith when you become prisoners. Because if you keep your faith, what will happen to you? You will live. Paul's borrowing this. Isn't this a cool statement? Can that be applied to our lives too? Keep the faith. What happens if you lose your faith? Today in 2009, what happens if a person loses his or her faith? What happens to your spiritual lives?
You're dead.
You can die. Valuable lesson here from Paul, from the Old Testament. Okay, we've got to move to a new verse tonight. You really haven't got to a new verse yet. How many are doing the calculations how long this class is going to be? There's too many zeros, I know. Let's go now, Romans 1:18. Can you believe this? A new verse. Romans 1:18.
The wrath of God is indeed being revealed from heaven against every impiety and wickedness of those who suppress the truth by their wickedness.
Remember what Paul just wrote. Keep the faith when things get bad. Now he starts a section of his epistle that gets ugly. Paul now is going to dig into some ugly stuff. The bad news in our lives. Does anyone just have a heading right in the beginning of verse 16? I mean, above that. I mean, in big bold. Humanity lost without the gospel. Paul now is going to give us some bad. He's going to tell us what humanity is going to be like without the gospel. And we're going to get into some ugly stuff here. Any idea why Paul wants to start his epistle? He just tells us, don't be ashamed of the gospel. Any idea now for the next couple pages, Paul's going to talk about the ugly stuff. What happens to humanity without the gospel? Why would he do that?
To warn people.
Okay, warn us, wake us up.
So they won't be shocked when they see it around them.
Okay, when you won't be shocked. Good. Good answers.
Well, the whole purpose was to introduce the gospel.
Okay.
That's what it's all about.
Okay, that's all
Nobody
about.
knew about this.
All right.
Nobody
So he
knew.
starts first with the bad news, what life would be without the gospel. And then afterwards, he tells us the gospel. So by starting with the really bad news, he gave some great answers. What else could be a reason? What's that?
We are afflicted because of righteousness.
Okay, that's good. Good point.
He's writing to a real group of people in a real period of time. And if these are really Romans he's writing to, they lived in a horrible culture of total wickedness and debauchery and every crappy thing you can imagine human beings getting involved in. That's why Rome fell.
Okay. So he's pointing out some of the realities that the people are living in.
Were the Romans having trouble?
Yeah, they were going to be
The church, I mean?
The church?
Yeah. That's he hadn't been there, and he's writing to the...
Right, he's writing to
heard about
what's
it.
there.
Yeah.
But think about it. He first gives the bad news about the world without the gospel. Then he gives you the good news that humanity can experience with the gospel. So what do you think that does? When you hear the bad news first, and then you hear the good news,
You forget the bad news.
well, you forget the bad news, and the good news sounds
Good.
really good.